In issue 2 of Simply Lettering, we're looking at resist techniques as part of my masterclass, and one of the techniques is using heat embossing. So as you can see here, the heat embossing has actually resisted the watercolour that I've then put on over the top. It's very, very easy to achieve. You don't have to use gold embossing powder, you can use any colour, but sparkly gold is a bit of a favourite of mine. So let's have a look at how we do it. So the first thing we're going to do is our heat embossing. Now I'm going to use an embossing pen. Many of these come with 2 tips. So you've got a bullet nib on one, which is perfect for fine detail. And as you can see, it's actually a clear ink on this Versamark pen. So you won't be able to see necessarily where you're writing. We'll go over that in a moment. And then we've got a brush nib on the other end as well. So brush nib, of course, for brush lettering looks beautiful, but if you prefer to use the bullet nib, if I just bring in the project that we were talking about, I've actually used both the brush nib for the brush lettering and then the bullet nib for the lettering through the middle as well. So you can use both. So what I'm going to do is, I'm working on watercolour paper, so I'm going to go over one letter at a time and heat each one as I go. This way the ink doesn't soak into the watercolour paper quite so quickly. If you're working on a smooth cardstock or paper, such as say photo paper, you will have a little more time to work. So I'm going to go over brush lettering the same way as I usually would. I'm using my thick strokes when I go downwards, and then I'm going to do my thin strokes upwards, but I'm also reinforcing each one by going over a couple of times. I'm going to quickly put on my gold embossing powder and tip that off into the pot. Just here, a little bit of excess, move that away. Now what I usually do when I've got excess like that is I just take it and tap it over a bin. There we go, to remove that. Put the lid, always put the lid on your pot before you heat emboss, because you don't want the heat gun to blow it around. Test it's on, and then we'll melt this. So there we can see that our heat embossing has melted and it's now formed like a molten metal on our piece of paper, which is absolutely beautiful. I'm going to continue and do the rest of the word, one letter or maybe 2 letters at a time, just to give that chance to stay wet before I heat it. And then we'll come back and do the watercolour technique afterwards. Now, because I'm working on watercolour paper, and you may find the same, sometimes your ink really soaks into the paper ever so quickly, and when you come to put the powder on, you'll find it doesn't always stick with complete coverage. So the good idea is to actually heat set that anyway. As you can see with my R, I've got a few little spots that are missing. And then once it's dry and cooled down, you can go back over with either your brush pen, or if it's just small areas, with the bullet nib on your pen. Either way, so I'm just going to go straight back over here in exactly the same way and just do a second coat. And while I'm here, I can just add some more if I need to in any areas, but this is pretty good otherwise. Same again, I'm just going to put my embossing powder on all over to catch those areas, tip it off and then heat set it. lid on this. I've got some on the table here, so just wipe that off. And let's set this. So there's our word dream, and it's all been heat embossed. So you can see we've got a little bit of shine on there. It's beautiful. So now we can add our colour over the top. I would always recommend a water-based ink or paint. You could use water paints, a palette, but I love Ecoline inks. So these Ecoline inks, they're available on Craft Stash. They do come with a little dropper, which will come in handy in a little while, as you'll see. So I always put the dropper onto a piece of kitchen towel or something so it doesn't roll around, and then I use direct from the bottle, or I use a little pipette just to take a tiny amount out and put it into a palette. For this I'm going to wet my paper. Now I'm not going to wet the entire piece, I'm going to go over where the word is. Bear in mind this is a watercolour paper, so it will hold the wet, and I'm going to do just like a rough splodge, not quite going to the edges, just extending that water a little way. So you probably won't see that very well. I'm not sure if I can just hold it to the light so you can see any shine on there, but it is on there. Like I say, not quite to the edges, so we get this rough look. If I show you the original and just remind you how that looked, you see, so that's the sort of shape I've gone for with the water. So now what I'm going to do is your paper will bend, so you can hold it back flat again. And what I love is that the sparkle in the embossing powder has actually, some of it has gone onto the paper and extended with the water, but that's not a problem. Now I'm going to drip a couple of drops of this around, and then I'm going to take a wet brush and just extend those a little. So this means I get a really, really good coverage of that pink colour. You could use a brush and apply it that way, which is how I did my blue, but I just love how vivid the colours are when they've come direct from the pot with the little dripper. Dripper or dropper. So there we go, using a wet paint brush. I'm dabbing, I'm not brushing, I'm just dabbing there. Now, I'm actually going to do a couple of different layers of this. So I'm going to dry this layer and then I'm going to go in with a second one. So again, you can leave it to heat dry, or you can use your heat gun, which I'll use. Now I've got a couple of little puddles here that are still quite wet, and I don't want to bring my heat gun too close because of course I could reactivate that heat embossing and make that melt again. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of kitchen towel, dip it into these puddles and soak up the excess. And what I love about this technique, especially when you're heat drying it rather than letting it dry naturally, you're actually getting some beautiful lines of colour, as we can see here. So where the colour some has dried and some has not. That to me is a true watercolour look. Right, so for the most part that is now dry. So what I'm going to do now is go back in with a little more ink. So back over with my water, very roughly in the areas that we did before, just dabbing. Again, if you've got some excess on there and it's starting to puddle because your paper has bowed, just use your kitchen towel to soak up the excess. Just in the middle there. I don't want too much of that there. And then I'm going to go in with my ink once more, with a little pipette, mostly around the edges, because I want those edges darker than the rest. Okay, you can use your brush again. In fact, I'm going to use a slightly smaller brush this time with some water on, just to extend these and just to give them a helping hand to help them blend out a little bit where you need it. Lots of water, because again we can soak it up if we need to, and I like this natural look of them starting to blend into each other. Before I dry this, and while it's all quite wet, I'm going to add in My last little effect, which is some gold ink. This one's a Winsor & Newton one. And gold ink is mesmerising because when you first apply it, you can actually see all the little particles of gold moving around. Now I'm only going to dip this into the edge. Does that look beautiful? So I'm just dipping it into the very edges and allowing it to naturally bleed out a little bit wherever it wants to go. A little bit on the table there. But it is water-based, so don't worry if you do get it on your work surface or anywhere you don't want it, just as I dripped there. Now with this you will find it will disperse quite well, so you may need to go and reapply in some areas afterwards. But with that you can again leave it to dry or heat set it yourself if you want to. Just bear in mind keeping that heat gun a little bit further away than you usually would because you don't want to melt the heat embossing again. So I'll dry this off and then we'll have a look at the finished result. So now that's dry, we can hold this up and have a look. So you can see all the different beautiful colour blends that you've got and the gold shimmering, not only from the heat embossing, but also from the gold around the edge where you've just dipped it in. So as you saw, the heat embossing does resist the watercolour. The great thing is you can use any colour heat embossing, so it could be clear if you wanted to, if you've got a nice colour background here. You could use blue, red, gold, black, whatever suits your style. And of course vary the inks that you're using as well. So let's have a look at both of them together for the different looks. Now the first one I did, the blue one that's in the magazine, this is actually, I believe, 3 or 4 different layers of adding the colour, drying it, adding more colour, drying it. So you do get a few different tones there, but you can see with 2 you can still get a beautiful effect.